Welcome to You Are From God, where we open God's Word to discover His image in ourselves and the people around us. I'm Scott Taylor.
And I'm Tyler Hall. Thanks for joining us today. So today, Scott, we're going to start a new series, a three-part series on self-control. Self-control is a really important topic anytime, but certainly as we think about how we are striving to be children of God, how we are striving to look at other people and treat other people as image bearers of God, self-control is an important tool that we need to be using. The Bible is pretty clear that this isn't just something that you are talented at or you have a knack for or you're just not very good at. It is a skill that we can develop, and the Bible says we must develop if we're going to follow Jesus. There's an interesting parallel between two proverbs in the book by that name from the Bible. You look at Proverbs 16:32, Scott. It says, "Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." So it's this picture of somebody who has their anger under control, their spirit, their disposition. They can rein that in. They can be self-controlled. And it says, you're better than somebody who can conquer an entire city, which is pretty awesome to say. Later on in the book, in Proverbs 25, verse 28 says this, "A man without self-control is like a city broken into and left without walls." So here you have the tale of two cities, if you will, from the Bible. You have the city that's taken over because the one who's taking it over is the one who's ruling his own spirit and having the self-control. And then it's the city that is comparable to this man who is without self-control. The city's just broken down and left without walls, and anybody or anything can just run right on in and overwhelm him. And so it's an important illustration, I think, to really lay the groundwork of understanding what self-control is about. This is absolutely understanding the choice and the power that God has given each of us to be at the driver's wheel of our life. We don't have control over a lot of things, but how we react, how we think, how we plan around doing things is immensely important because we do have a say and we can take action in those things. So over the next few episodes, we're going to dive into this. And today we just really want to think about the idea of self-control as it's applied to our thinking. Before we even say anything, before we even act or do something that we might associate with self-control, this whole process really starts in the mind. How am I thinking about myself and other people and the situations that I am in?
It's so fascinating, Tyler, with this subject. When you talk about, or I think of Galatians, the 5th chapter, with the fruit of the Spirit, and we always talk about those like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and you're like, those, I love those. There's things that I'm striving to do better. I'm pretty good at those things already, and then you hit self-control. The fruit of the Spirit.
And that's the last one, right?
Self-control, yes. And so there's an importance of understanding that God tells us, to the point you just made. God tells us we can control this. Mm-hmm. It is something we're able to do. The other thing that we see, though, is God's children. It is one of the fruit of the Spirit that when we draw closer to God, and He is our life, as Colossians 3 will talk about, we can understand that a fruit of that, getting closer to Him, is that we're going to grow in self-control, because the greatest example of all of this is Jesus and His self-control and us striving to be like Him. It's the attitude that we see in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, when it's talking about Jesus and what He was willing to give up and what He was willing to go through for us. You talk about self-control. The one who had all power and was willing to die is, just the ultimate example of this. And then you bring it to us. And certainly there are times whether we're talking about not being able to control myself on what I eat or how I react to something, that self-control piece that we always will talk about. A lot of times, Tyler, it just comes down to whether or not I really want to control myself in those moments, or am I just trying to make an excuse for me to act out on something because I haven't allowed myself to mature in this area of my life? It actually takes a little work for me to get control of myself, which comes with humility. It comes with all the different things we talked about on this program. But the reality is, you'll hear people say, I can't do it, and God says you can.
Yeah.
And so we certainly need to understand that.
It's not impossible. And I know it can feel impossible. I think when we talk about specifically self-control in the mind, I think half the battle, maybe even more, is the idea that we don't even stop to think about what we're letting drive our lives, whether it's emotions, whether it's habits, whether it's just the rhythm of life that we've become accustomed to, without even stopping to think, hey, is this good for me? Is this pleasing to God? Is this a positive influence on myself and the people around me, or is this hindering me? Is this holding me back? And that requires self-reflection, taking the time to actually think and having some control over how I think. I love Romans chapter 12, just from the standpoint of it says at the beginning of that chapter that we need to be renewed in our minds. We have to change the way we think so that we're not conformed to the pattern of this world. We need to be renewed in our minds so that we are discerning what the will of the Lord is. We want to think the way God would think. We want to see things from God's perspective. At the end of that chapter, though, Paul will go into all these situations. He'll talk about those who are persecuting you. You need to bless them. You don't need to be prideful. You need to give yourself to humble tasks. You need to live in harmony with one another. Don't be wise in your own sight. Don't repay evil for evil. So all these situations that obviously is demonstrating Christ to yourself and to the world, you need self-control for all of that. And I just love the way that he ends in verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I mean, if you could summarize the two verses in Proverbs about the city being overrun or overcome, be like a man without self-control, and then the one who is overcoming a city is like that one who has control and reign of his spirit, you get a pretty powerful picture here, and you're not trying to be overcome by evil. You're not letting the situations of life dictate how you feel or how you act. You get to overcome evil by choosing the good, by choosing to focus on godly things, by pursuing godly goals, and by keeping your eyes fixed on the godly ideals that God has put out for us and that he explains to us. This is why I think Titus 2 is such an important verse when it comes to understanding the way we think about ourselves and having control over ourselves. Titus 2:11, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people. Verse 12, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. He goes on and talks about that's all because we're waiting for the return of Jesus, that we're living as people who are zealous for his good works, or we're a people for his possession. But verse 11 and 12, just there, Scott, the grace of God has appeared. And it says in verse 12 that grace trains us to turn away from ungodly things and to live self-controlled. So you say, I want to be a more self-controlled person. How do I get there? What's the first step? How do I even start on this process of growing in this fruit of the Spirit? And I love that verse 11 of Titus 2 makes it very simple. You need to think more about God's grace. You need to think about how much God has favored you when you did not deserve it. You think about the love of God and his grace and mercy and love, and that grace trains us. When we really focus our hearts and our minds on the example of Jesus, as you brought up, and what God has done, is doing, and has promised to do for us, that mindset, that paradigm, that way of viewing the world and myself, that's going to train me when I'm applying it to live self-controlled, upright, and in a godly way, no matter what the situation is. That doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, but there's certainly a starting point there to understand how awesome God's grace is, and because he has been so amazing beyond words to me, I want to show him my devotion. I want to live for him, and so it's that grace that begins the training process for me to actually want to have control over my actions and over my body.
Taking the time to think, it seems like it's such an easy thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
But how often do we speak and you're trying to grab the words out as they're coming out of your mouth? Or how often do we act and you almost have the same thought of, why am I doing this in the moment? When, as God's children, to your point, when we're training ourselves or we're thinking about what Jesus has done for us, what God has done for us, we understand, or at least meditating on his grace and his mercy, it just changes our perspective of how we're going to act, and it gives us time to think, as James will talk about. It's that thinking before you speak perspective that we need to have. And I think of 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, Tyler, verse 5, where he says, we are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. We are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. Every thought captive. the understanding for us is that we are able to do that. The question is, how do we get to that point? And I think that's what's so powerful of what we were talking about here, is the idea that you have got to see what Jesus has done for us. We have got to focus on him. I always think of Philippians, the 4th chapter, with this subject, because it's a progression that we have to have. We need to view God near us. We understand that he is near when we have a relationship with him. We are walking through him. We're able to give him our anxiety, all those things. But he says in verse 8, finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute, if there is any excellence and anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. It's not just simply going to happen simply because we say, okay, now I have a relationship with God. There's the training part. There's this part of taking the time, putting in the effort, as 1 Corinthians 9 will talk about, that we need to put in the exercise. We need to put this into practice where we're focusing on these things. We're putting ourselves in our mentally into these situations of how I'm going to stay out of something or how I'm going to act when I'm in those situations. It's actually just looking through the glasses that God has given us through that prism, and truly reacting the way that we're supposed to react, because that's how Jesus would do so, and that's who we're trying to be like.
Right. And obviously, when you think about just how much of this principle of self-control starts in the mind, of how we're thinking about situations, it leads into how we plan around our day, which we'll get into in the next episode, but it has to come from this mindset of the way that I think about my situations needs to be totally devoted to Christ. There's a lot of military language I've noticed. Obviously, we started with the overtaking a city or being like an overtaken city. Romans 12 was the idea of being overcome or overcoming. Here you have the idea of taking thoughts captive. We're not letting things go out of the realm where we're thinking in ungodly ways, where we're bringing them in under the subjection of having a Christ-centered mind. And I think that's what Paul is really getting at in 1 Corinthians 9, where we'll end the discussion today. He ends that chapter there in verses 24 through 27 talking about self-control, certainly for himself, but the way he describes it is an image that even a lot of people today, I think, can appreciate, where he's using the example of athletes. So in verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others I myself should be disqualified. So Paul makes an important point here. It starts with the mind. It starts with, he knows what the right thing is. He knows what to preach. But he says, I need to discipline my body. I actually have to make a plan for myself. I can't run aimlessly. I have to have an aim or a goal. And then I have to actually exercise that to keep myself under control so that I'm not disqualified. And I think it's really important in this, as he uses the athlete as the example. He says, they're doing it for a perishable wreath. We have a reason much bigger than that to exercise self-control. This is about an eternal reward, the eternal inheritance that's been promised to us in God through Jesus Christ. And so why do we go through all this effort? Why do we take the time and energy and the focus to be self-controlled? Because of what God has done for us. It goes back to being trained by grace. And the last point that I'll stress here is from verse 25, that they are exercising self-control in all things. This is a muscle that we need to stretch and use in every corner of our lives, whether it's in our marriage, whether it's in our workplace, whether it's in the church, whether it's in our personal time. We need to exercise self-control in all things so that we can do it for the glory of God, for the sake of being His children, because we know that we are from God.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this program. Be sure to subscribe on your platform of choice so you never miss an episode.
Would you do us a favor and recommend this program to someone you know? We pray this simple act of sharing can encourage both of you in the faith and open up doors for meaningful and Christ-centered conversation. You can find us at youarefromgod.com. Click the connect button at the top of the page if you'd like to send us a question, give us feedback, or offer a suggestion for an episode. Catch up on previous episodes, find the year-long devotional, and more by visiting youarefromgod.com.